Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the second of our 3 fall lectures, the 2025 Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter, St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library Lecture Series. On behalf of the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, we are pleased to continue our collaboration with the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter and host this lecture series. Before we begin, we ask that you all please mute your devices. Should you be joining us remotely and have any questions, please type them into the comments section. After our talk tonight, we will pose your questions and those from our audience to tonight's speaker, Andrew Hahn. And now I'd like to introduce John C. Gunther, FAIA Lead AP, an architect who serves as president of the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter. He will introduce our speaker for this evening's talk. John?
Thank you. Thank you, Trent, for your welcome and for hosting this talk. Please know how appreciative we are to the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, for our continued collaboration for our Architecture Around the World lecture series. It is my privilege to introduce our friend and colleague and tonight's speaker, Andrew Hahn, Executive Director, Campbell House Museum, 1508 Locust Street, St. Louis, Missouri. Andy Hahn is 7th generation St. Louisan who has been passionate about history and maps since he was a kid. As a student at St. Louis University, he interned at the Couples House, where he was bitten by the old house bug. Since 2003, he has worked as director of the Campbell House Museum, an 1851 townhouse in downtown St. Louis. Mapping St. Louis is his first book. It is published by Reed Press. Tonight, Andy will talk about Mapping St. Louis, a history of the Gateway City in 40 rare maps. In the digital age, maps are more important and accessible than ever. Today, thanks to mobile devices, maps literally tell you where you are going. But maps are just as important in the past, or just as important in the past. They not only helped you navigate the world, but also guided future plans and dreams. The lecture, Mapping St. Louis, charts the growth of the city from its founding in the 1760s to the present day. Many different styles of maps are featured. Maps for exploration, and navigation, pocket and atlas maps, development and planning maps, pictorial maps, and fantasy maps. The lecture and book, Mapping St. Louis, are your guide to charting St. Louis's rich history and may spark ideas about where the city may be heading. And now, please welcome Andy Hahn as he presents Mapping St. Louis, a history of the Gateway City in 40 rare maps. Andy?
Thank you, John. I'm supposed to give this to you. Or does it go down here? Great, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Welcome. Thanks for being here. It's my pleasure to be at one of my favorite places, the St. Louis Public Library, to tell you about maps and our city's history. Maps have always held a special interest for me from the time I was a little kid, as John said, and I found one of the greatest pleasures about working on this book and this project is that I found that I'm not alone, that there are many people out there that have a special affinity for maps. They are fascinating not only in the stories they tell, but often in their amazing designs, whether it's an old map or a new map. So my love of maps is really the tale of 2 houses. It's how I like to tell how I got introduced to them. So next slide. So this is the first house. This is my grandparents' house on Oakwood Avenue in Webster Groves. They lived here for more than 40 years, and in their retirement, they were great travelers going all over the world in the 1960s and 70s. And in the den of this house, hanging on the wall, was a map. Next slide. And this is that map, or a copy of that map. This is Hammond's International Map of the World, published in 1958. And I was telling John and Trent, I'm excited particularly to be here because it's not very often I get to do this presentation with a screen that is this enormous. So it's pretty exciting for me to see these maps, 10 and 12 feet wide. So this is the map my grandparents hung on the wall of that den, and they really committed to this map. This was meant to be a feature of this room. They didn't frame it and hang it on the wall. They didn't tack it to the wall. They actually used wallpaper paste, and they pasted it to the wall. And then when the paste was dry, my grandfather took some molding and cut it to the right shape and painted it and tacked it to the wall to set it off nicely. And when I was a kid, and I would go spend time there, of course you're a little kid, 4 and 5 years old, and you'd be forced to take a nap. And this is the room I would nap in, and I would lay on the couch and I would look at this map, and I was fascinated by how big Greenland was and these lines that connected across the ocean. And as corny as it sounds, when my grandparents would come back from one of their trips, my grandma had like a bamboo stick in the corner, and she would point out on the map where they had been. It sounds like old-time school or something, but that's the way that it really was. So this is the first house and the first map that inspired me. This is the second house, as John said. This is where I work. If you don't know it, shame on you, because it's literally 1 block from here. It is on Locust Street, originally Lucas Place. And this is the Campbell House Museum. I've been privileged to be the steward of this building for the past 20 years. And we use maps every day to tell visitors about how our city has grown and evolved through the decades. And this is one of those maps. This is the first map of St. Louis made specifically for an atlas. This is the map of St. Louis from Colton's Atlas of the World, published in 1855. It's also one of the very first maps of St. Louis to show a new neighborhood of Lucas Place. So it's one of the first times this name appears on a map. And of course, that is Locust Street today, the street right here on the north side of the library. If you haven't visited us, I encourage you to come up the street and visit us. We're open for guided tours 5 days a week. And we would love to welcome you and show you what St. Louis looked like in the Gilded Age. And that was the commercial portion of this presentation. So whenever you look at a map, you have to put yourself in the mindset of the map maker. Why were they trying to make this map? What is the story they were trying to tell? Now, thankfully, like books, maps usually have titles printed on them. So maps can be made for a wide variety of reasons. This map of St. Louis is a navigational map of the river made in 1837. Probably one of the most famous men to ever make a map of St. Louis. This map was drawn by Lieutenant Robert E. Lee, who in 1837 was a young Army lieutenant who would go on, of course, many decades later to have a famous career leading the armies of the Confederacy. But he created this map to help solve a problem with the river in St. Louis. There's maps like this one from 1882. This is a traveler's map of St. Louis. If you had come here as a tourist or a visitor, you might have purchased this map either at as you got off the boat at a levee, or perhaps at the train station. If you notice a series of concentric circles that radiate out from the very center, from the levee, each one of those circles is a mile apart. And so that helps you gauge distances and helps you figure out exactly what distance you're going. Now, usually when I give this talk, the screen is, about as wide as my arms. And I can usually then say, the map you see on the screen is about the size that you see in real life. Obviously, this is much bigger. But this original map folds more than 50 times. Because, of course, it was meant to be used. It was meant to travel with you. It was meant to fit in your pocket. And when it's fully folded, it's the size of the palm of my hand. It's obviously a bit of a challenge to be able to undo that carefully and then refold it so you can put it back in your pocket. There's maps like this one. This is a planning map from 1907. This map was created for something, for a report called the Civic League Plan. In the afterglow of the World's Fair, the city of St. Louis commissioned what's still considered today one of the most influential and important urban plans ever created. Architects and urban planners still study this plan today. That's how important it was. This is one of many maps featured in that plan. And this map was a proposal to create a series of greenways that linked various parts of the city. It proposed creating a new series of parks in St. Louis County. You see Jefferson Barracks, Merrimack Highlands, Creve Coeur Lake. And it proposed to link not only those new proposed parks, but our existing parks. You see Forest Park, Carondelet, Tower Grove, O'Fallon Park. It proposed linking those with parkways or greenways. This is, of course, before the car, essentially, 1907, but it's very similar to the work that Great Rivers Greenway is doing today. And it just goes to show you there's perhaps maybe not too many new ideas in the world. This map, of course, like I said, is from 1907, so quite old. And lastly, there's even maps that are fantasies, that aren't real. This is a transit planner's notion of what St. Louis's light rail / metro / subway system might look like if St. Louis was, let's say, the size of Tokyo. According to this fantasy, and it's not all fantasy, at the core of it, the red and blue lines, most of that is our existing metro system, Metrolink system. But according to this fantasy, you could take a train from Carlisle, Illinois, on the very far right of the map, to Wentzville, Missouri, on the upper left. And that's a journey of about 90 miles. But again, this isn't real. This is a notion of what could be. So, but before we get into a little tour of maps of St. Louis, we have to talk about this. And I think everyone recognizes what this is. It's become the iconic symbol of our city, the flag of St. Louis. It's a relatively new symbol. It was only adopted by the city in 1964. It replaced an earlier official flag of St. Louis. And it was part of the way to celebrate the bicentennial in our city that year. This is one of the things they did, is they commissioned this new flag. The gentleman who designed this flag intended it and considered it a map at its heart. It's a very basic map. Of course, you couldn't navigate by it, but he wanted to represent St. Louis at the confluence of not just two of America's greatest rivers, but two of the world's greatest rivers, the Mississippi and the Missouri. So he chose this gold disc with the old French symbol of the fleur-de-lis at the center, placed at the confluence of the two rivers flowing from the left side of the flag, and then, of course, becoming one. So remember that next time you look at this iconic symbol, that it is indeed a map telling us where we are. To thank you all for coming out. Actually, I have sticker versions of this. I hope you come up afterwards, and I'll put these out on the stage, and please take some of these as a little remembrance of the map of St. Louis that's also a flag. So now I'm going to take you on a little tour. The book features 40 maps. Today I'm just going to kind of briefly give you a tour of about 5 of those. And I'm excited today because quite a few of these I've never included in a presentation before. And given the host of this lecture series, the Society of Architectural Historians, I wanted to really focus on maps that told, at least in some part, a story of architecture. So the 5 highlighted maps are the ones I'm going to share with you today. One from every century, at least one from every century of St. Louis's history. And we're going to start, as I always start with this presentation, because you have to start at the beginning, right? So next. So this is, and my gosh, this is so cool. Because usually, like I said, this is so small you can't tell what anything is. This is the first map of St. Louis, the first map that shows the street grid of the city. And you might at first glance say, I don't understand what this is or what I am looking at. This map was made in the fall of 1767. It's a manuscript, it's unique, it's a drawing. It was made by a French-speaking Spanish military officer who was sent up the Mississippi River from New Orleans to take stock of the new Spanish colony of St. Louis. And the Spanish authorities in New Orleans and in Madrid were particularly interested in St. Louis as a strategic location, of course, because it is at the confluence of the rivers. And that was the main reason to make this map. But the person who drew it, thankfully not just didn't draw the actual confluence, they drew the greater area. So what you're actually seeing is the Missouri River coming up from the top right of the map as it goes down, and you see the Mississippi River traveling from the right, and the confluence is right there on the right side, and the new larger Mississippi flows down. Next slide. And this is what you see just below the confluence. Like I said, this is considered the first map of St. Louis because it is the first to really include, and here's St. Louis right here, the street grid of the new city. It's labeled Payne Court Village Francois, or Short of Bread French Village. That was kind of the nickname of St. Louis. In its early years, they called it Short of Bread. You probably noticed that there is a larger village on the east side of the river, and that is the village of Cahokia. Also, as he labels it, a French village, but under the dominion of the English. Cahokia was larger and older than St. Louis in 1767. People had been living in Cahokia for probably 3 generations by the time the city of St. Louis on here, the west side of the Mississippi, was founded. And just south of both Cahokia and the new village of St. Louis, you see villages of Peoria Indians. Of course, native peoples had been living in this area for thousands of years. The man who drew this map chose to only label 2 specific buildings. One was the fort at the confluence, and one was the building that was just highlighted, and that was the mill. The mill was constructed to grind grain into flour. Of course, if you like bread, you need flour, and you need some way to grind that flour. So one of the first larger structures built in St. Louis was this new mill. Actually, just months after the ink on this map was dry, the mill was bought by the Choteau family. And it was under their ownership that the mill was greatly expanded and created one of the iconic parts of St. Louis's landscape. If you can believe it, this photograph of the mill was taken almost 100 years after the map we just looked at was made. Now, is this the same building that you see on the map? Probably not. There may be some elements to it. But this photograph was taken a few years before the Civil War by an enterprising photographer named Thomas Easterly, who turned his camera on lots of St. Louis's buildings and early landscapes, so we're forever grateful to him. He's actually labeled this, he's scratched it in the plate at the bottom if you look carefully, it says Choteau's Mill. And in this photograph, and this probably prompted him to take it, the mill was probably being torn down. But the mill had been expanded by the Choteau family, and part of that expansion included damming a little creek that powered the mill. As the mill was originally constructed, there was a small creek. The first map that we looked at, the 1767 map, labeled it as the Little River. It was just a little creek that drained part of what's now downtown St. Louis. The water running through that creek turned a wheel that turned the millstone. The Choteaus expanded the mill. They created a bigger mill. They wanted a bigger grindstone. They didn't have enough water in that creek, so this was their solution. You see the Mississippi River down here in the corner. You see the blocks and streets of St. Louis, and this map's from about 1795. You see the little creek or the little river, and what you see up there, that little square, is the mill, and a pond that was created by damming the mill. If you notice, and we'll advance one more time, it'll get even bigger. You see how the cross-hatching represents the building up of earth to create a dam to create the pond. The pond provided a more powerful and regular source of water so that they could run the mill more effectively. That pond became one of the defining features of St. Louis's landscape for almost its first 100 years. And this is an artist's representation of what that pond looked like around the year 1835 or 1840. As you can see, it looks quite romantic. Did it really look this beautiful? Well, who's to say, but there was probably some elements of this. You see St. Louis is out and about really enjoying it. You see a man here in the foreground sketching or drawing. You see someone fishing. You see people out in boats, rowing. And of course, on the east side of the pond, on the east bank, you see the village of St. Louis quickly growing. And again, this is so great because on this screen you can actually see those buildings there on the east bank of the pond. The pond was such an important part of St. Louis's landscape at this point. It provided, of course, power for the mill, it provided water, and it provided opportunities for people to have recreation. Unfortunately, not too long after this view was created, the city began to grow exponentially around the edges of the pond. And as people lived close to the pond and all these little inlets, their trash went into the pond, their sewage went into the pond, and very quickly the pond became someplace that was perhaps not so nice to live by, and people didn't want to spend time on it anymore because it became dirty, and probably accounts even describe it as smelly. So by the early days of the Civil War, the pond was in the process of being drained and emptied and eventually filled in. I want to point out to you just a couple buildings. You see the red arrow. That arrow points to St. Louis's new church. Today we call this the Old Cathedral, but then it was just called the Church of St. Louis. This view was made by the same person who made the view of the pond, a guy named John Weil. And if we go again, and one more time, that square-looking tower is the tower of Christ Church Cathedral, which was on South 5th Street. Both of these, if you could see it, the old courthouse would be right here on the left side of the screen. So impressive buildings from St. Louis's early days, from the early days of statehood as part of Missouri. So that's the story of Choteau's Pond. Of course, there's no vestiges of it left downtown anymore. But if you know can approximate in your mind where the Metrolink station is on the west side of Busch Stadium, that was approximately the east end of the pond. And then it kind of went in the shape of a snake, kind of the way that the Lake of the Ozarks does. It went all the way, kind of following what's now Clark Street, all the way just past Union Station. So what's now the old police headquarters, City Hall, Enterprise Center, even Union Station itself, were either in, where the pond was or on the edge of where Choteau's Pond stood. So we're going to fast forward a bit to 1848. St. Louis is now growing extremely rapidly. And this really cool map was included as part of St. Louis's 1848 city directory. It was included in essentially, they of course didn't have telephone books, but think of it as a modern day telephone, what we would call a telephone book, although those aren't even applicable anymore. But basically a listing of every resident of the city, where they lived and what their business was. For instance, for Robert Campbell, it would say R. Campbell, and it would say 41 South 5th Street. R stands for reside, and then it'd say 12 South Main Street for his business. That's what a directory was. And this map and view was included in that directory. It was inside the cover. You would open it and then would fold out 3 times. Now, it's not meant to be a practical map that you would use for navigation. It's a map that is meant to show off St. Louis. It not only shows you the blocks and the streets, you can still see Choteau's Pond, but it also shows you this beautiful view of the city from the Illinois side. But perhaps the most distinguishing feature of this map is its border, showing what was St. Louis's newest and most up-to-date and fashionable structures. They really wanted to show St. Louis off as a place that was really growing. If you advance, I blew that up so you could really get a sense of the detail that the engraver used to create this beautiful view of the levee, and then a kind of a little view here of some of the border. So there's quite a wide variety of buildings shown in this border. There's 22 in total, and they encompass kind of the entire spectrum of uses. There's public buildings like the courthouse, private buildings like the Bank of Missouri, secular buildings like the public school, religious buildings, there's 6 churches, there's a social building, the Oddfellows Hall, and even an industrial building. One of those industrial buildings is this building, the Shot Tower, on the north edge of what's now downtown. The Shot Tower was certainly the tallest building in St. Louis in 1848, and it was constructed to create shot. If you don't know what shot is, it's the little lead balls they use to shoot out of guns, and using a shot tower is the most productive way to make those balls. They actually have molten lead at the top of those towers, and they carefully drip it, and as those drips fall down the inside of the tower, they cool and they form perfect spherical shapes, and at the bottom of the tower, on the inside, they hit a pool of water, and they cool instantly. And that's how they mass-produced what we would call a bullet or a piece of shot at that point. There's buildings like the Odd Fellows Hall, next. The view on the right shows you the vignette from the edge of the map, but the view on the left was a hand drawn by a St. Louisan, quite a gifted artist, as you could tell. And the amount of details that were on some of these buildings are really quite impressive for any antebellum city. This 3-story building implies Corinthian pilasters you see here, and a very elaborate pediment. And if we go forward one more time, you can even get a closer view of all of that detail. They were not wasting any money on not showing off. They really wanted people to see that St. Louis was an up-and-coming place. Next. This is the vignette along the very bottom in the center of this 1848 map. It shows the old market house, alternately at various times called the town hall, where the city government took place, but think of it as the first Soulard market before there was a Soulard market. These open areas on either end was kind of the marketplace for the city. This view was inspired by Next, John Wilde's very famous view of the St. Louis levee from the same time, from the 1840s. This one's obviously got a lot more detail in it and has this beautiful color as well. It's hard to imagine how exciting it must have been to stand down on the levee when the whole world just kind of collided. Whether it was the sound and the noise and the dirt of these boats, whether it was things coming off the boat, beautiful people coming off the boat, it just must have been a pretty impressive sight to see. The vignettes around the edge of this map also include St. Louis's brand new courthouse. When they were planning to build this courthouse, they went actually to Boston, Massachusetts to get funding to fund the cost of the construction of the building. And the people that they talked to in Boston said, St. Louis is so far away, it's going nowhere. There's no way we're going to give you money for this. If we advance one more time, here's again a beautiful view of the courthouse as it existed in the late 1840s, early 1850s. The building behind the courthouse, the red one, is the famous Planters House Hotel, which in antebellum St. Louis was the finest hotel in the American West. And lastly, in this vignette, we also have a view of the Second Presbyterian Church, one more time. Here it is, again in a view by John Casper Wilde. This beautiful church was dedicated in 1840 at the corner of 5th and Walnut Streets. If you know where the downtown Marriott is, next to the ballpark, this hotel was on that corner. The steeple rose to a height of 170 feet, and construction cost $42,000. It was reported, and this is a quote from the newspaper at the time of its dedication, that, quote, "A person coming from the Rocky Mountains, or who had never seen any building dedicated to God beyond a frame meeting house in the woods, would be struck by the grandeur and magnificence, both exterior and interior, of the new Second Presbyterian Church." So that's St. Louis in 1848. We're going to fast forward about 50 years to talk about Compton Heights. Of course, the first inhabitants of St. Louisans actually lived on what's now the Arch Grounds. That was the village of St. Louis, and where most St. Louisans lived for the first 75 or so years of the city's history. By the 1840s, new neighborhoods were being developed on the outer edge of the old city, think of what's now the heart of downtown St. Louis. If you know where the Civil Courts building is, where Busch Stadium is, those were the new neighborhoods of the 1840s. By the 1850s, new streets like Lucas Place, the street right up here on the north side of the library, were being developed to draw a wealthy new merchant, the wealthy new merchant class out to brand new houses, and the city was starting to grow west very quickly. During the 1870s, the area around the new Compton Hill Reservoir, which you see at the top right of this map, had become a very popular spot for large country houses. Houses for people who had a townhouse here in the city, but in the heat of the summer wanted to escape, or on the weekends escape to a large house that might sit on as much as maybe 5 or sometimes even 10 acres. By the 1880s, St. Louis was growing even more rapidly. And 2 of the country residents of this neighborhood got the idea to create a new development. Those residents actually lived in Compton Heights before Compton Heights existed, back when it was country farms. They were 2 German Americans who had great success in this country, a man named Henry Harstick and his neighbor Julius Pitzman. Harstick made a fortune in river barges, and after the Civil War, he operated the largest barge line on the Mississippi River. Pitzman was a civil engineer and a surveyor, and given the nature of his business dealing with land, he no doubt did a lot of speculation in land as well. In 1885, work began on the new Grand Avenue Viaduct, which changed the development of South St. Louis forever. Before that viaduct existed, it was very difficult to make it from the north side of the railroad tracks, let's say along Olive Street, south. And it still is kind of difficult today if you know that part of St. Louis, because there's only a handful of bridges that go over the railroad tracks that come off the south end of downtown. The Grand Avenue Viaduct really made it easier to develop and to use this west end of the city. That, coupled with the fact that in 1888, St. Louis University moved from 9th and Washington to their new campus at Grand and Lindell, it was clear that the city was permanently moving west. Harstick and Pitzman, the same year as St. Louis University, moved and incorporated the Compton Hill Improvement Company. And it was their plan to create from the city street grid a very new type of neighborhood. When they incorporated this company, all the streets that you see dead-ending in today, what's the curve of Compton Heights, all of these streets crossed over. There was a street grid on what was Compton Heights. And it was their job, their vision, to create a new type of neighborhood that was based around 2 streets that weren't going to be straight. They were going to be set off of the city grid, and they were going to have a very gentle curve. They were going to be very, very different. This was a huge undertaking, and the type of thing that if you were in the construction business is almost inconceivable that this amount of labor could go into something like this. The first thing they had to do is they had to recreate or reshape the land that this neighborhood would be built on. It took a year, and throughout that year there were 600 men and 300 teams plowing, shoveling, digging, and hauling away dirt. They wanted to create a different landscape for this neighborhood. They started by laying out the streets, and once you laid out the street was the low ground. Then they had to build up high ground for all of the houses to be built on. Like I said, this took a year to lay out the street and to re-level and reset the ground. But by the fall of 1890, the first building permits were issued for Compton Heights. Next slide. Here are some of the advertisements that were meant to tempt people to come all the way out to this new neighborhood. No dust, no smoke, no soot. If you want a home lot, if you want to buy on speculation, see our agents. These beautiful new streets were something that they were really trying to sell. Now, not all the lots cost the same amount. Next slide. Here's the core of the map blown up a little bit so you can see it a little bit better. You have Grand Avenue on the top, Nebraska Avenue on the bottom, and the curve of Longfellow and Hawthorne as they create this beautiful, I don't know what you would call it. It's like a pickle shape almost. The price list on the right lists the lot costs. You see, depending on the desirability of the lot, the ones on Grand Avenue cost a lot more than the ones here on the Nebraska end of the neighborhood. Of course, the Grand Avenue is considered the grand entrance and would be fancier and more expensive. We want to blow it up one more time. Here's that Grand Avenue entrance here at the top. You see the lots are all numbered. Some of the names on these lots, some of the lot numbers have names on them. That was the person who had bought it. The map even shows a few structures that had been built up here in the southwest corner. What you see here along the north end of Compton Heights are some of those old country houses. Here you see the house of Mr. Harstick himself. If you want to go forward one time, there's Mr. Harstick's house again. Up here, lots 1, 2, and 31 were purchased by Adolphus Bush. It was his plan, apparently, to build the house right at the entrance when you come into Compton Heights. Nobody ever built anything in lot 1. It's still empty. If you go forward again, you see the home of Otto Bowman, or the lot of Otto Bowman. The year after this map was made, he would build this beautiful house, which still stands on Hawthorne. He was the proprietor of one of St. Louis's largest music stores. He sold pianos and sheet music and musical instruments, and this room has a large music room with leaded glass windows around it that feature musical instruments in the leaded glass windows. If you go again one more time, one of the more interesting things that I noticed about this map is next to Mr. Harstick on what's called Block 1363. This is where the Magic Chef Mansion sits today. Originally, that lot went all the way here to Longfellow. Eventually, 4 lots were put in on the back end of what's now the Magic Chef property to build more houses. I'm going to go one more. This is the east end of Compton Heights. If you go again, you can actually see Mr. Pittman's house, his country house up there on the far right. I'll show you, if you go again forward one more time, we're going to go back to the beginning and again. You'll see a red arrow appear again and again. The red arrow is pointing down the street you just saw. So this is looking down Hawthorne at the very beginning. This is Grand Avenue is right behind you. This photo is taken about, I believe, about 1898 or so. If you want to go again and again and again. So now we're going to go down the left side, or the Longfellow side. The arrow is the view of the photographer. And if you go again, and here we go, looking down the north end of the sidewalk, north side of the sidewalk, north side of the street on the Longfellow side. So that's a little bit of the story of Compton Heights. Go again. We're going to skip all the way ahead to 1959. And this tells a little bit of the story of Shaw's Garden. This map is the 1959 Centennial Plan that was intended to revitalize Shaw's Garden at its 100th birthday. Of course, the Missouri Botanical Garden, as it's officially known, but Shaw's Garden as to many of us, opened in 1859. It was Henry Shaw's passion and pet project, and ultimately at his death, he willed it so that the garden could go on indefinitely. As many of you know, Shaw was an English immigrant. He came to St. Louis before Missouri statehood and invested much of his profits and his business in land, including this area that became the Missouri Botanical Garden. As I said, in 1959, the garden produced a very detailed plan to completely revision the garden. And it was in ways that I think many of you will find shocking. And we're probably very grateful that they didn't do most of it because it was pretty dramatic. But the garden actually had an earlier, maybe even slightly more interesting plan, and that was from 1905. This is a detail of the drawing of the 1905 plan created by the Office of Frederick Law Olmsted. Of course, the father of landscape architecture, famously designed Central Park. His son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., continued in the business, and in the late 19th century, the garden commissioned the Olmsted office to create a plan to revision the garden for the 20th century, and this is the detail of part of their revisioning of the garden. Both this plan and the 1959 plan were very heavy-handed with buildings. They wanted to rip down a lot of buildings that we know and love today. One of the buildings that they didn't want to rip down, if you go forward, is where the red block is, and that was the main entrance that was created by Henry Shaw in the garden's early days. And this is a photograph of what that entrance originally looked like in the 19th century. It's still the entrance at Tower Grove and Flora Place, although it's been rebuilt and re-envisioned quite dramatically from this original view. So we now know the entrance of the Botanical Garden on Shaw Avenue, but historically, until the 1970s, the entrance was on Tower Grove Avenue, and this is how people entered. If we go forward again, one more time. Here we are back to the map. We have the main entrance down there. One of the few buildings that the 1904 plan calls for saving would be Tower Grove House right here, Henry Shaw's original country home and its mausoleum. The buildings we know to the south would be quite dramatically changed and altered, and in some places replaced altogether. Henry Shaw had built an amazing conservatory in the 1860s, and the Olmsted firm suggested demolishing that conservatory and replacing it with a much larger building that they called the Palm House. If we advance, the first red box is the location of the new Palm House that the Olmsted plan called for. If you advance again, the second red box is the location of the old brick conservatory that Henry Shaw had built right after the Civil War. And if you advance again, this is a very rare photo showing both of those buildings standing actually at the same time. They were only standing for the same time for about 2 years. The building straight ahead, which was perfectly in line with the main entrance and is where the climatron sits today, is the 1913 conservatory, or Palm House rather. The building on the right is Henry Shaw's 1870s conservatory. Not too long after this photograph was taken, that conservatory on the right was demolished. We want to advance again. We're now back to 1959 when the garden had very, very grand plans. And like I said, thankfully many of those plans didn't come to fruition. They wanted to create a number of zones in the garden. They wanted to refocus the garden's entrance from Tower Grove Avenue to Shaw Avenue, as you see on this drawing here on the right. That part of the plan they actually completed. They wanted to, if you can believe it, deconstruct the Linnaean House completely and move it 4,000 feet to the south end of the garden where they were going to create a historic district. They wanted to put the Linnaean House on the south side of Henry Shaw's Tower Grove house. They were going to dismantle all the historic buildings in the garden and put them inside this green square, and that was going to be, quote, the historic district. On the right where you see 3, 2, 6, and 5, this was a series of new research buildings, public buildings, display houses that they intended to build. The cornerstone of this plan was number 1, and I think you can probably tell by the shape of it what that is. That is the climatron. That is essentially the only thing from this plan that was constructed. And I think we're pretty happy it was constructed because, of course, it's an amazing architectural and engineering feat. Here, if we advance again, here is one of the original drawings and the proposal of the construction of the climatron. I believe this drawing was made in 1958. This was a drawing that was included in that souvenir booklet that proposed this plan. The climatron, you could argue still looks pretty modern and futuristic today, but if we go back to the late 1950s, I mean, this was positively space age. It was radical, it was futuristic. Of course, it's famously based on the geodesic dome concept, and it was designed by the local architecture firm of Murphy and Mackey, who were well-known architects at this mid-century period designing buildings in St. Louis. So that's the story of the Botanical Garden and the 1959 Centennial Plan. So the last map I'm going to share with you is an example of a pictorial map. These are very special types of maps. They are maps that tell their stories and impart most of their information through pictures. I think you very clearly see the basics of our city's geography in this map. You see the big bend in the river. Of course, you see the River de Pere here. You see the Merrimack River. You see, of course, we have to include the major highways because that's how people know where they are. You see all the major interstates. But what this map is trying to impart is the breadth and scope of museums that we offer in our city. The name of the map is Sea Museums of St. Louis. And this map was created in the spring of 2017 when the city hosted something called the American Alliance of Museums Annual Meetings and Museum Expo. This is the largest museum conference in the world, and that spring, over 6,000 museum professionals came from all over the world to St. Louis to learn about the newest trends in the museum industry. And the group that organized this convention commissioned local artist Dan Zetlock to create this map. This map was used in a number of ways. It was actually blown up larger than, probably about the full size of this screen, and placed on the wall at the entrance to the convention. And then printed versions were given out to attendees as well. I helped organize this convention. I can tell you that visitors were universally impressed by the huge variety of museums that were on offer here in St. Louis. If you advance, you see kind of in the core. Now, Dan, the illustrator, had the challenge, of course, trying to illustrate lots of museums, of course, in the downtown area, and to illustrate those and make that understandable. So he has this distinctive little drop, but you follow the line back, and then there's a little piece of artwork that tells you a little bit of the story of that particular place. If you go forward again, of course, two of my favorite places are on here: the St. Louis Public Library, represented by the book, and the Campbell House Museum up there right next to the arch. A pictorial map is meant to be fun, it's meant to be whimsical, but it's also meant to be informative. So, there's no mistaking that the Châtillon des Minots mansion is a house. So we wanted to really impart the sense of that place in the artwork he chose to draw. If you go forward one more time. I'm going to end my presentation here. This is a view of St. Louis that was created at the dawn of the Civil War, right before the Civil War. It was published in 1860. It was created by a gentleman who really wanted to show St. Louis off as a place that was quickly growing, that was quickly expanding, that was a place to move, that was a place to invest in. He lovingly titled the print, if you can't see it, it says on the bottom, Our City. In case you don't know what Our City is, he very conveniently put in smaller letters underneath, St. Louis Mo, to describe, so people knew exactly what they were looking at. Many of the features, the geographical features that you've seen in some of the maps and views we've already looked at, you can see in this view, most notably the huge bend, natural bend that St. Louis sits in the Mississippi River. You see the hubbub of the levee, the absolute, must have been frenetic pace of business, of people, of stuff moving, of noise, of dirt, It must have just been such an exciting space. The levee in 1860 was the airport, the train station, and the interstate highways all rolled into one. It's how everyone came to St. Louis, and it's how you left St. Louis. The steamboat was king, and the steamboat took you everywhere that you wanted to go. But I think my favorite thing about this map, or this view, because it's technically not a map, it's a view, is the horizon. This very kind of, you can see what looks like a big hill in the distance, and this very romantic looking sky. It shows the west. And I don't know if you've noticed, but with the exception of one, every map I have showed you is orientated the same way as this view, meaning that west in all these maps has been on the right side of the page. Now, if you open an atlas or you open Google Maps on your phone, it will printed maps today, and the phone will automatically orientate all the maps so that north is on the top. North is at the top of the page. But that's not the way it has been in St. Louis for almost all of our history. Really until 2021, when the city issued a new official ward map of the city. That was the first time the city's official map went from a landscape map, wide, with north on the right and the river along the bottom. In 2021, they turned the map, so it's now a portrait with the river along the right and north at the top. And the west is, I think, the reason why all these old maps of St. Louis are orientated the same way as this view. The river was the entrance. The river was the first thing. It's going to be at the bottom of the map. The west was the future. The west should be at the top. The west was the most important thing. Of course, goods come from the east. People come from the east. Money comes from the east. But the west is why people come here. Now, of course, many people stayed, but many more people traveled through. And I think this view represents that so well. So I hope you enjoyed this look at St. Louis's history through the lens of maps. I would encourage you to look up old maps online. Every map I featured is in the public domain. You can go out and find it yourself. In most cases, they're very high quality. You can blow them up. I don't know if you'll be able to blow them up this big, but I thank you all for coming out tonight. If you could advance one more time, there is the book version. I do have books here tonight if anyone wants to buy one. Of course, this institution has many copies of the book in it. I don't know if they're checked out or available, but you can get it from the library. And if you advance one more time, look for a year from now, I'm coming out with kind of the Missouri version of this book called Mapping Missouri. When I agreed to do Missouri, I really wasn't particularly excited about it because I didn't think there were many interesting stories. But there are maybe even more interesting stories about the state of Missouri and its borders than even about St. Louis. So thank you all for coming out tonight. Questions from the audience, or Trent, I don't know how we do questions from online, if there might be any audience questions? Yes, sir.
I'm kind of interested in the role that the growth of the streetcars played in the development of the various neighborhoods and the spreading out of it. Are there any good streetcar maps?
Yeah, so there's one in my book from 1915 called the Tourist's Trolley Map.
Okay.
The name of it's actually printed that on the map, Tourist's Trolley Map. And that's an indication that that map probably wasn't made by St. Louisans because they never called the streetcars in St. Louis trolleys. They were always streetcars.
Right.
So that's an interesting fact. And that map details, you can see where the city grew, that the streetcars followed them. Sometimes the streetcar went first, and that was particularly true of the suburbs, but within the city limits, it was generally the streetcars followed the people. The best known example of the streetcars following the suburbs is Webster and Kirkwood. Those predate the streetcars, but the streetcars went out there pretty early, and they were responsible for a lot of early growth in Webster and Kirkwood because it was easy to commute in because of the streetcar. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions?
How many of the maps were more or less like one-offs versus like for
Oh, in the book?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. I think there's only 2 manuscript maps in the book, so unique. Most of them were printed, for promotion, as part of a publication, for an event like the museum's map. So most of them weren't created in small numbers. But the manuscript maps are in many ways, of course they're the rarest because there's only one. And that first map I showed you was kind of unknown to St. Louis historians for well over 100 years. It wasn't really discovered as existing till the 1940s, I believe, when an architecture historian, a guy named Charles Peterson, was doing work about colonial St. Louis, and he tracked that map down in Madrid, because that map was made for the Spanish authorities. When the ink was dry, it was sent back to Spain, and it's still there today. It's part of the National Library collection in Spain. So those in some ways are the most interesting, those rare ones. Yes?
At what point did people start having aerial technology to help making these maps?
Aerial technology you're not going to really see until the 1930s. And by that point, the maps were so accurate that aerial technology for city maps didn't do anything. Yeah. I mean, you could do, if you want to really go down the weeds, read about 19th and 18th century surveyors and how they create these maps. I mean, these people went through, what they could achieve is kind of unbelievable with no technology at all. I mean, their technology was like a scope and chains. That's how they measured distances, was it literally with pieces of chain. And that they can make, it's one thing to make a map of a city street, but to survey the northern border of the state of Missouri that way, in a straight line, no matter which way the terrain goes, that's challenging. So, I mean, aerial views, I think, did nothing for city map making. Now, in rural areas, I think they were probably helpful, but not so much in cities. Yes, sir.
Pittsman still exists today, the surveyor,
Uh-huh.
the oldest surveying company in St. Louis, maybe the state. I'm just wondering if you've had a chance of going down there and rummaged through any of their archives.
I have not, but I'm sure there's treasures there. So Pittsman, he started this company.
They're in
He was a
Maplewood,
surveyor his whole
Sutton, I
life,
believe, yeah.
and this company still is a business. Yeah, he probably of late 19th, early 20th century St. Louis. He probably left more of a mark than anyone, because his name is all over plats and surveys everywhere. So he was very influential for sure. Yeah. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Come up and get your sticker. Thanks for being here. You're welcome. Thanks for your help with the slides. There you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks for coming out.
And I agree with you.
Andy, I'm Robert Berger, I'm an architect. and
Hi, nice to
you
meet you.
mentioned your affiliation with Couples House. Did you know about the acronym?
I did. I took the very last class he ever taught at St. Louis U.
We're going to have another one of these on November 18th. It's going to be online only.
Oh, yeah. I know Terry very well.
Thanks for letting us know that.
I do, yeah. Here.
Put it there so everyone can get some.
Yeah. Yeah, great guys. Yeah. Father McNamee was
If it weren't for
inspiring.
him, Couples House probably wouldn't be
Oh,
there.
definitely.
I mean, he virtually chained himself to the place, and I think, according to the way he told me, is that out of disgust, the president, I forget which Jesuit it was.
Probably Father Reiner or Father Fitzgerald.
I think it was Fitzgerald,
Yeah.
kind of just said, okay, see what you can do with it, thinking he was gonna fail.
Fail, and then they could get what he wanted anyway.
Yeah, well, he had, did you know about Carol, was it Carolyn Skellig Buford?
Oh yeah, she gave him all the furniture, the money for the furniture.
What she would do is she'd go on buying trips to Europe.